Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about congruent. And for something to be congruent, it's pretty obvious and it's written right here. For any shape to be congruent, it must be exactly the same size and exactly the same shape. Although all of these are triangles, they're different, therefore they're not congruent. For polygons to be congruent, the corresponding sides and the corresponding angles must be congruent. So we're going to write that down. For a polygon to be congruent, corresponding angles and sides must be congruent. So if we take our triangle, which is our smallest polygon, we can see that in order for this to be congruent, all three sides must be congruent, which they are. AB is congruent to FE, BC congruent to ED, and AC congruent to FD. And all the angles must be congruent, which you see A is congruent to F, B is congruent to E, and C is congruent to D. I would like you to take a second and write those corresponding angles and corresponding sides down. Angle A is congruent to F, B is congruent to E, C congruent to D. Segment AB congruent to segment FE, BC, ED, AC, FD. Then the last thing we want to focus on is a congruent statement. If you want to say that triangle ABC is congruent, you must make sure that the angles line up. So if you say ABC, you must say FED. Another example, if you want to start with B, you could say BCA, but you must say EDF. So here is two examples. These are what we call a congruent statement. So once you know that the triangles are actually congruent, then you can write the congruent statement. Now we're going to use this picture and take a second to try to answer some questions. Okay, now let's look at this picture. The main thing is this: you want to find the congruent statement in any congruent figure because that tells you what letters or angles or sides are congruent. So D, E, F, G, it's not just D is not congruent to Q because it's just slid over. You have to realize that angle D is congruent to S. So if you want, you could go over here and put a 102 because if D is 102, so is S. G is congruent to R, so I could go over here and put an 84. And I know that F is congruent to Q, so I could put a 68 here. Then I want to pay attention. I know that segment DE, which is the first two letters, is congruent to the first two letters SP. So if DE is here, I could put 8 here. I know that GF is congruent to QR, so I could put a 12 here. And then at this point, could you go ahead and take a second and figure out what the actual values of X and Y are? Okay, hopefully you were realizing that 2x minus 4 equals 12 will get us 2x equals 16 and x is 8. And then I need to plug in, it's actually 6y plus we know what x is equals 68. 6y equals 60 and y is 10. Okay. All right, if you take a second, we're going to answer this together. And before we answer these, I want you to pay attention to something. In this drawing, you'll see there's equal signs, but in front of that is an M. So if there's an equal sign in a measure, we are absolutely looking for a value. But when I get here and there's a congruent sign, I am not looking for a value. I am looking for what segment it is congruent to. So please pay attention to that as you answer the questions, or make sure you would notice that. And then 9 and 10 are both congruent statements consisting of 3 letters. Those 3 letters have to match the correct 3 letters in the other triangle. In the values and the answers, just in case you wanted to check all your work. One thing I want you to notice, guys, is this is definitely by far one of the most important things in the problem, and that's the congruent statement. If you look here, I know the measure of y. If I look up here, y is the same as n. So if I look at my picture, n's 124, I know this is 124 degrees. If I come to number 9 and say, what is LNM? I just need to look at this congruent statement. LNM is just simply written backwards. So I go right here and I write it backwards, ZYX. I don't want to spend the time trying to find it in the picture when you can simply just use the letters. YXZ, Y, then X, then Z is N, then M, then L. Okay, so make sure you use that. Obviously, if I need the values, then I'll pay attention to the picture. So hopefully you did okay. Let's look at the next one. If you would take a second and figure out what X is. If you look at this, hopefully you got that X is 11, because if 45 can go where the double marks are and 80 can go where the single marks are, then I know that I took 180 minus those values to get 55, and I know 55 has to equal 5x. That example leads us to my next page, which is our last page, and this is just the third angle's theorem. And the third angle theorem says this: if A is congruent to D and B is congruent to E, then C must be congruent to F. And if you think about it, I think you guys already know this. If A was 30 and this was 100, that would be 130. If this is 30, this would be 100. That would be 130, which leaves us 50 left no matter what. So the theorem states if 2 angles of one triangle are congruent to 2 angles of another triangle, then the third angle must be congruent. Okay? And that's the third angle's theorem. All right, hopefully you have a good understanding of congruence.